Namibia's struggle with South Africa for independence was rooted in the centuries of colonial rule which Namibia had endured from Germany, and its success was unique in that with the help of the United Nations, it became the first post-apartheid democracy in Africa. The three main actors in the conflict were SWAPO, South Africa, and the United Nations. The conflict has its roots in colonialism, which would seem at first to be a cultural or political cause, but in reality economic security was the culprit. The outcome of this conflict is an example of how third-party mediation can be very beneficial to the resolution of conflicts between nations. Namibia, formerly known as Southwest Africa, similar to most African nations, began its life as a colony. In 1884, after centuries of exploitation by European nations and even the United States, Namibia was claimed by Germany as German Southwest Africa. The Germans who had colonized Namibia began fighting the native tribes for their land. The Herero and Nama tribes decided to fight back against the Germans, but were greatly defeated. After the war, the Germans began a harsh colonial rule over Namibia. Land was seized from the native tribes and given to German settlers, while the natives were forced to become laborers in the mines and in other industries. Namibia's natural resources had led the Germans to exploit the natives, which created a serious imbalance of wealth and a great gap between the rich white settlers and the poverty-stricken native Namibians. The Germans lost control of Namibia after World War I. In 1915, the British government instructed South Africans to invade Namibia, and the South Africans gained control by May 12 of 1915. With the Treaty of Paris in 1919 and the creation of the League of Nations, Namibia was given to South Africa as a protectorate. But South African rule turned out to be no better than German rule had been. South Africa was controlled by the British, and the same separation and prejudices continued as the upper-class whites controlled the native populations. Over the next few decades, several rebellions against the South African rule occurred, and when workers were kept from forming unions, they also began to resist the control of South Africa. In 1959, the Ovambo Land People's Organization was formed in Namibia's capital. The group was originally established to fight for workers' rights, but later began to advocate Namibian independence and changed its name to Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO. In the mid-1940s, South Africa attempted to incorporate Namibia into the Union of South Africa by petitioning the United Nations, but was denied. South Africa also began its attempts to obtain independence from Great Britain, which it achieved in 1961 by becoming the Republic of South Africa. Meanwhile, SWAPO held its National Congress in 1961 and decided it must take matters into its own hands and began to prepare for a rebellion against South African forces in Namibia. It was not until the mid-1960s that the United Nations decided to become involved with the conflict in Namibia. The support of the United Nations allowed Namibia a victory when in 1971 the International Court of Justice declared that South Africa was illegally occupying Namibia and was under an obligation to withdraw its administration immediately from Namibia. In 1973, after sending UN Security General Kurt Waldheim and another delegate to Namibia to observe, the United Nations General Assembly decided to officially recognize SWAPO as Namibia's government. But South Africa still would not relinquish control of Namibia. By 1977, the three Western permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, plus the two Western non-permanent members of the Council, Canada and the Federal Republic of Germany, began to function as the Western Contact Group. The purpose of this diplomatic entente was to find a way out of the growing Namibian quagmire that would be acceptable not only to the two principal protagonists, SWAPO and the South African government, but also to the wider world of African states and the rest of the international community. Delegates from the contact group were sent to South Africa to speak with the government, and during 1978 negotiations were being made between the contact group and the South Africans. South Africa had agreed in principle to some changes, such as allowing all political parties participation ending apartheid policies and helping Namibia gain its independence. But in trying to officially negotiate these terms between Namibian leaders and South African leaders, the two sides came into disagreement on how to achieve Namibia's independence. From this, the UN Security Council Resolution 435 was passed in September of 1978. The UN's plan to aid Namibia was created after South Africa refused the resolution of 1976, which called for the withdrawal of South Africa from Namibia. The 1978 resolution had three major parts to be implemented by the UN: a ceasefire to halt the fighting between SWAPO and South African troops, a new election that was held fairly, and the creation of a constitution for Namibia declaring its independence. Cold War politics and unrest in neighboring Angola delayed negotiations and resolution for years, and SWAPO continued to struggle. The ceasefire was finally called on April 1, 1989, but was quickly thwarted by the South Africans. The fighting resumed for several days, and the completion of the UN's plan came into question. But later, on May 15, 1989, the ceasefire was reinstated and successful, and the plan moves forward. Namibia was able to gain its independence from South Africa with the help of a third-party mediator, the United Nations. The UN intervened in the Namibian-South African conflict after seeing the SWAPO and Namibians' resistance to the South African government's harsh ruling and apartheid policies. The example of Namibia shows how intervention by a third party as mediator can be a great asset to conflict resolution, especially when neither side is willing to give up without a fight.